Hello and welcome to our 7-8 minutes of weekly Torah talk. Our guest today is Rabbi David Wolpe, the Max Webb Senior Rabbi at Sinai Temple, Los Angeles. Hello, Rabbi. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
In our Parsha, God creates the world in 6 days, then adds a Shabbat for rest. He forms the human body from the dust of the earth and blows into him a living soul. God then takes a side from the man and forms it into a woman. Adam and Eve are placed in the Garden of Eden and commanded not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. A serpent persuades Eve to violate the command, and she shares the fruit with Adam. Both are banished by God from the garden. Eve gives birth to 2 sons, Cain and Hevel. Cain quarrels with Hevel and murders him and becomes a ruthless wanderer. A 3rd son, Shet, is born. His 8th generation descendant, Noach, is the only righteous man in a corrupt world. The first pasuk of Parshat Bereshit says, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, in the beginning of God's creation of the heaven and the earth. So, Rabbi, you are challenged with the easiest and most difficult Parsha of the year.
Yes. So thank you. I appreciate the challenge, and I would say that 3 fundamental themes of human life, of the deepest themes of human life, are embodied in this parasha. The first being that moral rules, right and wrong, are woven into the fabric of the universe. That's what it means that God created the world. That God created the mountains doesn't necessarily have implications for human beings, but the idea that God created a moral order has tremendous implications. That's one. The second is that human beings are mortal. They are in the image of God, but they are not God. And you know this because God says on the day you eat from the fruit, you'll die. They eat from the fruit and they don't die, but they become aware of their mortality. That's why they clothe themselves. They're aware of themselves as fragile human bodies. And why the first thing that Adam and Eve do when they leave the garden is the third great theme, which is to have a child, to procreate. Because human beings will still seek immortality in the midst of their fragility and mortality. So I would say those are the great themes: the moral order, the certainty of death, and the desire to transcend death and become more than. And all of those are in one stunningly rich and brilliant and wonderful parasha.
And would you say that eating from the fruit, from the barred fruit, gives them the knowledge or gives them these 3 themes? They are now aware of these 3 themes?
I think that the idea of the fruit, you ask yourself, what did they learn from the fruit? It says, Eitz da'at tov v'ra, the knowledge of good and evil. But it can't literally be the knowledge of good and evil. Because if they didn't know what was good and what was evil, then they didn't know that it was good to listen to God in the first place. And he can't punish them. So it has to be something more sophisticated than just simple right and wrong. And what I would say is that the deeper knowledge of good and evil is the knowledge of life and death. Why are things good or bad? Because we have a limited amount of time in this world. If we had forever, then big deal. You have a fight with someone, you'll make up with them in 2,000 years. What makes things urgent and good or bad is that we have limited time, and I believe that that's really what the Torah is trying to tell us by the eating of the fruit. Because when do you leave Eden? Eden being a metaphor for childhood. When you realize that things break and fade and die, then you will never be the same. Then you have left Eden.
And the question I find the most difficult is, why wouldn't God want us to have this knowledge of good and evil? Why would he want to prevent us from eating the fruit?
So there are 2 different answers depending on how you look at the Torah. One is that it's a setup. You know, God says you can have anything you want, just not that. Now, knowing human nature, if you put a child in a room and say you can touch anything except that, what is the child going to do? They're going to touch that immediately.
There is this famous psychological experiment that they did with children, leaving them with candy in a room.
Exactly. So that's one possibility, is that it's what's called by scholars an etiological tale. It's explaining how we got to where we are. The way we got to where we are was, of course, we ate the fruit. The other is that, it almost reminds me, I know that this is bringing the profane into the sacred, but it reminds me of the Star Trek episodes. There are so many where they go to a perfect world and they have a choice. They can live in this steady state perfection, or they can go back to the messy moral drama of the rest of the universe, and they always leave. And there is something about, there is no Torah if they stay in Eden. There's no wandering, there's no struggle, there's no anything. So part of God maybe wants to preserve us from that, but part of God is aware of the fact that all of human life is wandering in the wilderness. And that's what human beings have to do if they're going to grow. And you've got to believe that God wants us to grow.
So this is like the famous Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times.
Exactly. And we all live in interesting times, and especially now.
Yeah, and then after they leave the Garden of Eden, it begins, the interesting times begin immediately with the first murder of human history.
Exactly. And that lets you know that that built into this fabric of moral order is free will. And that means that people can do terrible things to each other. And God won't prevent them, because to prevent them makes people into puppets and robots. But instead we're people. So there will always be this Yetzer Hara, this evil that people need to struggle with inside themselves. And sometimes the Yetzer Hara will triumph with terrible effects.
And do we have any explanation as to why he decided to accept the sacrifice of one brother and reject the sacrifice of the other? It's one
the
of these,
usual explanation is that Hevel gave of his best, and Cain just gave, what was around. But there is also there is a sense throughout the Torah, in some ways, and I don't want to overstate this, that love is arbitrary. You love who you love. And even God. Why does it say that God loved David, Melech David? David was, in some ways, not a very admirable guy. But God loved him. And so there is a realization that love will go where it goes, and even God is subject sometimes to that sense of, I have fallen in love with this or with that or with the other, and that we as God's children have to deal with an arbitrary universe.
And it is also a first sign that, at least according to the Torah, love between brothers is a rare thing.
Well, I hope not a rare thing, since I'm one of 4 brothers, but it's certainly something that takes work and time. I love to quote the comedian Kathy Landsman has a line that holidays are a chance to renew your resentments afresh. And it certainly is true that when you get together with family, sometimes love takes work.
Right. One of the things I find difficult about Bereshit, and maybe the 3 first parshas of this book of Bereshit, is that the first era of human existence gets so little attention. It's 1, 2, maybe 3 parshas, and it's over. We are already into this story of the family of Jacob. Yes. So why don't we get more details?
Well, it's true. It's a really interesting question, because prehistory was so long and there was so much development. But really, I think that the sense of the Torah is to assert that God is the creator of all, and then to tell the story of one representative family. Because the arc of it goes like this. God creates the world, people are bad, right? As you said, Cain and Hevel. So he says, okay, I'm going to try it again with Noah, people are bad again. So finally God says, obviously this plan is not working. I'm going to now try with one representative family and see if they can serve as a model for other human beings. Whether that plan has worked is certainly a matter up for dispute, but that at least is the arc of the story.
Yeah. One last question. Do we get enough information about Adam and Eve to make us connect with them in any way? Can with people like Jacob and Joseph and Abraham, we can have some emotion. Do you have any emotion towards Adam and Eve?
I do, because of one line. When God asks that first question in the Torah, which, the Baal Tanya says is the question God asks at every moment, Ayeka, where are you?
Right.
That God asks us that all the time. And Adam says, I was afraid, so I was hiding. And when you hear that, you realize that you're dealing really with the same human nature that we have. That Adam and Chava are frightened, that they're lost, that they feel alone, and that for a moment, God's presence feels not comforting to them, but just scary to them. And so, in that sense, I connect, and I think most readers do. And what we seek, of course, is a God who is not only Yodea Machshavot, who knows our thoughts, but also is what the Talmud calls God, Rahmana. It's compassionate to us and teaches us to be compassionate to one another.
Rabbi, a new cycle of the Torah is always an exciting time. Thank you so much, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.